During my son's wedding toast, I spilled a glass of wine on my daughter-in-law's mother's $87,000 designer dress. It was an accident. My daughter-in-law instantly slapped me and cried, "You jealous old hag, clean it now." My son just laughed. I left. But when I got home, the real shock began. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here to listen. Stay here with me through this whole story and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my stories travel. I'm Nora, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood heartbreak. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for what unfolded at my son Kevin's wedding reception. The moment that would shatter 3 decades of believing I was a loving mother who had raised a good man. The accident happened during the champagne toasts. My hands were already trembling from nerves when someone jostled me from behind. The red wine arced through the air in slow motion, landing squarely across Victoria's ivory silk gown. The silence that followed was deafening. "You jealous old hag," Cleo, my daughter-in-law, shrieked as she rushed to her mother's side. "Do you know what you've done?" Before I could stammer an apology, her palm cracked across my cheek with shocking force. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. But it was Kevin's reaction that destroyed me. My son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father walked out, threw back his head and laughed, not an uncomfortable chuckle, but genuine amusement, as if watching his mother get humiliated was entertainment. "Mom's always been accident-prone," he announced to the stunned guests, his arm sliding protectively around Cleo's waist. "Remember the time she ruined my science project? Some people never learn." I bent down with shaking hands and began collecting the broken glass fragments, my cheeks still burning. Nobody helped. They just watched this elderly woman crawl around on her hands and knees while her own family stood over her like royalty, observing a servant. The drive home passed in a fog of disbelief. I don't remember starting the car or navigating the familiar streets. My mind kept replaying Kevin's laughter, the cruel amusement in his eyes as his wife degraded me in front of 100 wedding guests. That sound would haunt me for weeks. I sat in my driveway for nearly an hour after the engine died, staring at my modest house through tear-blurred vision. The porch light I'd left on seemed to mock me with its cheerful yellow glow. Inside, the silence felt oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it that morning when I'd been so excited, so hopeful about celebrating my son's special day. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent hours getting ready, choosing my best dress, the navy blue one I saved for important occasions. I'd even bought new shoes, spending money I couldn't really afford because I wanted to look nice for Kevin's wedding photos. Now that dress hung on me like a costume for a role I no longer understood how to play. What was I supposed to be in Kevin's life? I'd thought I was his mother, but mothers don't get slapped by daughters-in-law while their sons laugh. Mothers don't get humiliated at family celebrations and then forgotten. I wandered through my living room, looking at the photos covering every surface. Kevin at 6 months, grinning toothlessly at the camera. Kevin on his first day of school, clutching my hand. Kevin at graduation already pulling away toward his bright future. When had I stopped being the person he turned to and become the person he turned away from? The wedding invitation still sat on my mantelpiece, the elegant script that had filled me with such pride now seeming to taunt me. I displayed it for months, showing it to neighbors and grocery store clerks, so happy that my son was settling down with a successful woman from a good family. What a fool I'd been. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning through decades of memories I'd carefully stored away. The humiliation at the wedding had cracked something open inside me, and now everything was pouring out like water from a broken dam. I kept coming back to one devastating question. Where had I gone wrong? How had I raised a son who could watch his mother being publicly degraded and find it amusing? The boy I remembered would have defended me, would have been horrified by anyone treating me with such cruelty. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man I barely recognized, a man who had learned to see me not as his mother, but as an embarrassment to be managed, a problem to be tolerated at family events. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all the times over the past few years when Kevin had seemed distant, distracted during our phone calls, how he'd stopped visiting regularly, always claiming to be too busy with work, with Cleo's social calendar, with the demands of his sophisticated new life. I'd made excuses for him, told myself it was natural for adult children to become independent. Now I wondered if independence was what this really was, or if I'd been systematically pushed out of his life so gradually that I hadn't noticed until it was too late. The signs had been there. The shortened phone calls, the canceled visits, the way Cleo's eyes would glaze over whenever I spoke about anything from my world. I'd been so grateful for any attention from Kevin that I'd accepted crumbs and convinced myself they were a feast. So desperate to maintain our relationship that I'd allowed myself to become smaller and smaller in his life until I was barely visible at all. The worst part was realizing this hadn't happened overnight. This disrespect, this casual cruelty had been building for years. I'd just been too blind, too hopeful, too desperate to maintain the illusion of family to see it clearly. I kept circling back to one pivotal moment that had shaped everything. Kevin was 7 when his father walked out on us. Not gradually, not after months of fighting, but suddenly on a Tuesday morning in March. David packed 2 suitcases, kissed Kevin's forehead, and told him Daddy had to go on a very long business trip. Kevin stood at the living room window for hours that day, his small face pressed against the glass, waiting for the familiar sound of his father's car in the driveway. When dinner time came and David still hadn't returned, Kevin asked when Daddy would be home for supper. I told him maybe tomorrow, knowing it was a lie but unable to crush his hope so completely. The lie stretched into days, then weeks, then months. Eventually, Kevin stopped asking, but I could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he'd perk up whenever a car door slammed in our neighborhood. David never called, never wrote, never sent a birthday card or Christmas present. He simply vanished from our lives as if we'd never existed. I learned later from a mutual friend that he'd moved across the country and started a new family within 6 months. Apparently, fatherhood hadn't been the problem. We had been. From that moment forward, everything I did was designed to fill the void David had left behind. I became both mother and father, working overtime to prove to Kevin that one parent leaving didn't mean he was worth less. I wanted him to feel secure, loved, valued in ways his father had failed to provide. Maybe that was where I went wrong. Maybe in trying to compensate for David's abandonment, I'd spoiled Kevin, made him feel entitled to devotion without having to give anything in return. Maybe I'd taught him that love was something he could take for granted, something that would always be there no matter how he behaved. After David left, I threw myself into being the perfect single mother. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, my hands raw from the industrial chemicals, my feet swollen from standing 12 hours straight. The overtime pay went directly into Kevin's future while I made do with whatever was left. When Kevin needed new shoes for school, I wore my old ones for another 6 months. Even when the soles developed holes I had to cover with cardboard. When he wanted to join the soccer team, I sold my grandmother's pearl earrings to pay for equipment and registration fees. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in his happiness. I gave him everything I'd never had growing up. Piano lessons, summer camps, tutoring when his grades slipped. I wanted Kevin to know he was valued, that having one parent abandon him didn't diminish his worth. I worked weekends cleaning office buildings to afford his class trips, even when my back ached so badly I could barely stand. The college fund grew painfully slowly with my overtime wages. $20 here, $50 there, whenever I could squeeze a little extra from our tight budget. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day for 3 years to save money for Kevin's education. I told myself it was temporary, that once he was established and successful, he'd understand what I'd sacrificed for him. But somewhere along the way, my efforts became invisible to him. Normal, expected. I remember his 16th birthday when I'd worked extra shifts for months to buy him a decent used car. Nothing fancy, but reliable transportation that would get him to his part-time job and college interviews. When I handed him the keys, Kevin barely looked up from his phone. "Thanks, Mom," he'd said with the same enthusiasm he'd show for a new toothbrush. He was already texting his friends about weekend plans, the car forgotten before he'd even seen it. I found the unused birthday card I'd carefully chosen sitting unopened on his dresser weeks later, still in its envelope. College marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it at the time. State University wasn't good enough anymore. Kevin had developed bigger dreams and I had smaller savings. The gap between his ambitions and my reality was growing wider every semester. So I took out loans against the house, using my modest equity to fund his education at a private university across the state. I picked up weekend work at a local diner, serving coffee and eggs to families who could afford Sunday brunch, while I calculated tips in my head to pay for Kevin's textbooks. Ramen noodles became my dinner staple while Kevin complained about the quality of his dorm cafeteria food. I wore the same winter coat for 5 years, patching holes and replacing buttons, while Kevin needed money for a new laptop, new clothes for internship interviews, funds for spring break trips with his new sophisticated friends. The phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I'd ask about his classes, his social life, his plans for the future, Kevin would sigh with barely concealed impatience. "You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under, Mom. This isn't like your generation where you could just get a factory job and call it a career." His words stung, but I told myself he was just stressed about his studies. Young people said things they didn't mean when they were overwhelmed. I made excuses for his dismissive tone, his growing reluctance to come home for holidays, his obvious relief when visits ended and he could return to his real life. During his junior year, Kevin started talking about his classmates differently. Their families owned vacation homes, attended charity galas, traveled to Europe for spring break. I began to understand that my blue-collar background, my modest house, my secondhand furniture were becoming sources of embarrassment rather than symbols of the hard work that had made his education possible. I should have seen the warning signs when he stopped bringing friends home, when he started making excuses about why I couldn't visit campus for Parents' Weekend, when every conversation became about money he needed rather than experiences he wanted to share. Cleo entered our lives during Kevin's senior year like a perfectly manicured storm. Beautiful, polished, and carrying herself with the confidence that only comes from never having worried about money. She was everything I wasn't: educated at private schools, well-traveled, fluent in the social graces that came naturally to people from her background. The first time Kevin brought her home, I knew immediately that I didn't measure up to her standards. It was in the way her eyes swept over my small living room, lingering on the discount furniture and bargain store decorations. She smiled pleasantly enough, but I caught her taking photos of my kitchen on her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. "Your mother is so dedicated," she told Kevin during that first visit, and somehow made dedication sound like a character flaw. "It's sweet how she sacrificed so much for you." The word sweet dripped with condescension, as if my efforts to give Kevin a better life were quaint but ultimately misguided. Cleo never criticized me directly. She was far too clever for such obvious tactics. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt with carefully chosen observations. "My therapist always says that healthy relationships require boundaries," she'd mentioned casually over dinner. "It's so important for couples to establish independence from family influence." Or she'd share little stories about her own family. "Daddy always told me that successful people surround themselves with success. It's about elevating your circle, you know?" These comments were never aimed at me directly, but their message was clear. I was holding Kevin back, dragging him down to my level when he deserved to soar. I watched Cleo work on Kevin slowly, methodically. She'd compliment his ambition while questioning whether he was getting the support he needed to achieve his goals. She'd praise his intelligence while wondering aloud if he was being challenged to reach his full potential. Every conversation was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as concern. The changes in Kevin were gradual but unmistakable. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I'd ask about his life, he'd say I wouldn't understand the pressures he was facing, the sophisticated world he was entering. His tone grew increasingly impatient whenever I brought up ordinary things like my job or neighborhood news. After graduation, Kevin landed a position at a prestigious investment firm. Good money, impressive title, everything I'd worked so hard to make possible. I was so proud of his success, even as I felt him slipping further away from me with each promotion and pay raise. That's when the requests for money began, disguised as opportunities for investment and mutual benefit. Kevin sat at my kitchen table one evening, his face serious and businesslike. "Mom, I have a chance to get in on something really big at work. It's basically a sure thing, but I need to move fast." $25,000 from my retirement account. He explained it as an investment opportunity that would pay dividends for both of us. "You'll get your money back with interest in 6 months," he promised, already reaching for the paperwork I'd need to sign. This is my chance to really make something of myself. I signed without hesitation, liquidating nearly everything I'd managed to save over decades of careful budgeting. Kevin was my investment in the future, and if this opportunity could secure his success, then it was worth any sacrifice. I trusted him completely because he was my son, and sons don't steal from their mothers. 6 months, became a year. The year became 2. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about repayment, Kevin looked at me with genuine surprise. "Mom, that wasn't a loan," he said patiently, as if explaining something simple to a child. "That was an investment in our family's future." I thought you understood that. But I remembered clearly. I remembered him calling it a loan, promising specific terms, assuring me it was temporary. Somehow, in his mind, my sacrifice had transformed into his entitlement. My generosity had become his right, and my expectations of repayment had become unreasonable demands. The engagement announcement came with another request for money. The wedding would be expensive, and while Victoria's family was covering most expenses, could I contribute to the honeymoon? Kevin made it sound like an honor, like I was being included in something special rather than being asked to fund their romantic getaway. $15,000 from my vacation fund, money I'd saved to maybe see Ireland someday, gone to pay for their trip to Tuscany, a journey I'd never take but would finance for others. "You're investing in your future grandchildren," Cleo said sweetly when they asked. "Isn't that what grandmothers do?" I said yes, because I desperately wanted those grandchildren. I wanted to be part of their lives, to have a family again, to matter to someone. I didn't realize I was buying my way into a relationship that would never really include me, paying for the privilege of being tolerated at family events. The wedding planning process made my secondary status crystal clear. I wasn't consulted about arrangements, wasn't asked for input on venues or menus or flowers. My role was to write checks and stay out of the way while Cleo and Victoria planned their perfect day. When the invitations arrived, I stared at mine with growing dismay. No special designation as mother of the groom, no reserved seating at the family table. I was listed like any other guest, assigned to a corner table with distant relatives and family friends I'd never met. But I'd been so grateful just to be invited, so hopeful that maybe this wedding would mark a new beginning in our relationship, that I ignored all the warning signs. I bought a new dress, had my hair done, practiced my smile in the mirror because I wanted everything to be perfect for Kevin's special day. What a fool I'd been to think that day would be about celebrating family when I'd already been written out of the story. 3 weeks passed after the wedding without a single word from Kevin. No thank you call for my contributions to his honeymoon. No check to see if I was okay after being publicly humiliated at his reception. Nothing. The silence stretched between us like an ocean I didn't know how to cross. I moved through my days like a ghost, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. The house felt different now, contaminated somehow by the truth I could no longer ignore. Every photograph of Kevin seemed to mock me. Every memory felt tainted by what I now understood about his character. I couldn't even look at his baby pictures without feeling physically sick. That innocent child grinning toothlessly at the camera had grown into a man who could watch his mother being degraded and find it entertaining. The boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a bug now felt nothing when his wife slapped his mother. The worst part was the growing realization that this wasn't a temporary rift that could be healed with time and apologies. This was who Kevin had become, who he'd perhaps always been beneath the surface. I'd just been too desperate to see it, too invested in the fantasy of having a loving son to acknowledge the reality of what he'd turned into. I stopped checking my phone obsessively, stopped jumping every time a car door slammed in my neighborhood, stopped hoping that each day would bring some sign that Kevin remembered he had a mother who loved him. The waiting was killing me slowly, and I finally understood that I might be waiting forever. That's when I decided to clean out the spare bedroom. I needed something to do with my hands, something to occupy my mind that didn't involve thinking about how completely I'd failed as a mother or how thoroughly my son had failed as a human being. The spare bedroom had become a repository for memories over the years, filled with boxes of old papers, documents, and sentimental items I'd been too attached to throw away. It seemed like the perfect project to keep my hands busy while my heart slowly healed from the wedding disaster. I started with the closet, pulling out containers I hadn't touched in years. Most of it was predictable junk, expired warranties, Christmas cards from people I barely remembered, old tax returns that were no longer legally necessary to keep. The mindless sorting felt therapeutic, giving me something concrete to accomplish when everything else in my life felt broken beyond repair. Box after box yielded nothing but forgotten paperwork and outdated documents. I was beginning to think this cleaning project would be nothing more than an exercise in decluttering when my fingers found something unexpected at the very back of the closet, pushed far behind a stack of Kevin's old school projects. A banker's box labeled financial records in my own careful handwriting. I didn't remember putting it there, didn't remember what might be inside that warranted such official organization. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out, something in my subconscious already recognizing the significance of this discovery. The box was heavier than expected, packed with manila folders and loose papers that felt substantial in my hands. I carried it to the bed and sat down, suddenly reluctant to open it. Some instinct warned me that whatever was inside would change everything, that there would be no going back to the comfortable denial I'd been living in. But after 3 weeks of silence from Kevin, after years of feeling confused and manipulated without understanding why, I needed answers more than I needed comfort. I lifted the lid with shaking fingers. Inside were all the documents from the loans and gifts I'd given Kevin over the years. I'd kept everything, partly out of habit from my factory job where documentation was essential, partly because some small voice in my head had whispered that I might need proof someday. The first document made my breath catch in my throat. The original loan agreement for the $25,000 Kevin had borrowed for his investment opportunity. In his own handwriting, clear and confident, he'd written, "I, Kevin Sanderson, agree to repay my mother, Nora Sanderson, the sum of $25,000 within 6 months of this date with 4% interest." His signature was bold at the bottom, accompanied by the date and his printed name. This wasn't a gift. This wasn't an investment in our family's future. This was a documented loan with specific terms that he'd agreed to and never honored, despite telling me later that I'd misunderstood our arrangement. I kept digging through the papers, my heart pounding harder with each document I uncovered. The $15,000 for the honeymoon, another promissory note in Kevin's handwriting promising repayment within 18 months, the $12,000 for his car down payment, marked clearly as a loan on the check memo line in his own pen. But it was the mortgage application that nearly stopped my heart altogether. A credit report Kevin had filled out when applying for his house loan, listing all outstanding debts and obligations. Under the section for personal loans, he'd written, "Personal loan from M. Sanderson, $52,000. $52,000. He'd acknowledged the debt to the bank, used it to demonstrate his access to additional funds if needed for the mortgage, but had never mentioned it to me. To the financial institution, I was a creditor who deserved documentation. To Kevin, I was a resource to be exploited without accountability. The papers scattered around me told a story I'd been too naive to read while living it. This wasn't about Kevin forgetting his obligations or gradually becoming more selfish. This was calculated deception, systematic theft from his own mother, dressed up as family emergencies and investment opportunities. I spread every document across the bedroom floor, creating a timeline of deception that stretched back nearly 15 years. Each piece of paper was another wound, another betrayal that I'd been too trusting to recognize when it happened. Here was the documentation for the emergency car repair that turned out to be a down payment on a luxury sedan. There was the hospital bill for Cleo's supposed medical crisis that coincided perfectly with their weekend trip to Napa Valley. Every sob story, every urgent request, every appeal to my maternal instincts had been carefully orchestrated lies. The pattern was unmistakable once I saw it laid out chronologically. Kevin had learned exactly which words to use, which emotions to trigger, which guilt buttons to push to get me to open my wallet. He'd studied my weaknesses like a predator studies prey, using my love for him as a weapon against me. I remembered him sitting at my kitchen table 3 years ago, his face serious and concerned. "Mom, Cleo's been having some health issues. We need money for specialists, tests that insurance won't cover. I hate to ask, but could you help us out? Just temporarily until we get back on our feet." $20,000 from my savings account that day. 2 weeks later, I'd seen Cleo's social media photos from their romantic getaway at a resort that cost more per night than I spent on groceries in a month. When I'd mentioned the photos, Kevin had been ready with an explanation about Cleo's parents insisting on treating them to a stress-relieving vacation. Now, I pulled out my calculator and started adding up the documented loans alone. $85,000 in written agreements that Kevin had never intended to honor. But that wasn't the full scope of his theft. There were the undocumented cash gifts, the emergencies that never quite added up, the family contributions that went far beyond any reasonable expectation. When I included everything I could remember, the number made me physically ill. Over 15 years, I'd given Kevin more than $120,000. My entire life savings, my retirement security, my dreams of comfortable old age, all sitting in his bank account while I worried about paying for basic necessities. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the realization of how carefully Kevin had played me, how he'd studied my weaknesses and used them against me like weapons. My guilt over his father leaving, my desperate need to feel useful and wanted, my fear of losing the only family I had left. I thought about all the times I'd apologized to him over the years, apologized for not having more money to give, apologized for asking when he might pay me back, apologized for existing in a way that didn't fit his new life with Cleo. Every apology had been another small victory for him, another confirmation that he could treat me however he wanted, and I'd still come back for more. I'd trained him to see me as a victim by acting like one. I'd taught him that my love was unconditional, which he'd interpreted as meaning my resources were unlimited and my dignity was negotiable. I'd been so grateful for any attention from him that I'd accepted crumbs and convinced myself they were a feast. The documents around me told the story of a woman who'd been systematically drained dry by someone who was supposed to love and protect her. Kevin hadn't gradually forgotten his obligations to me or slowly become more selfish as he gained success. He'd been planning this exploitation from the beginning, viewing me as a renewable resource rather than a human being deserving of respect. I gathered all the papers and put them back in the box, my hands steady now for the first time in weeks. The hurt was still there, deep and raw and probably permanent. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something I hadn't felt in so long, I'd almost forgotten what it was like. Anger, clean, pure, righteous anger at being treated like a fool by the person I'd loved most in the world. For the first time since the wedding, I felt truly awake. And for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't going to apologize for taking up space in my own son's life. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't because of heartbreak. It was because my mind was racing, finally clear after years of confused fog. By morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The law office of Patterson and Associates was housed in a converted Victorian downtown, the kind of place that inspired confidence without the intimidation factor of the glass towers where Kevin worked. I'd found them online after searching specifically for attorneys who specialized in family financial disputes and elder financial abuse. The reviews were encouraging, and their website emphasized compassion for older clients who'd been taken advantage of by family members. Rebecca Patterson was about my age, with silver hair and kind eyes that sharpened when I spread the documents across her conference table. She read through everything methodically, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Her expression grew more serious with each paper she reviewed. "Mrs. Sanderson," she said finally, looking up from the documents, "this is quite comprehensive documentation. Your son was very thorough in creating a paper trail of his obligations to you." She tapped the papers with her pen. "These aren't gifts, regardless of what he's told you since. These are documented loans with specific terms that he agreed to and signed." "Is that good or bad for me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Even being here felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about family loyalty, about keeping problems private, about blood being thicker than water. "It's very good for you," Rebecca said firmly. "These documents alone establish a clear debt of approximately $85,000. That doesn't include any undocumented cash gifts, and it doesn't include interest on the overdue amounts." She pulled out a calculator and started adding numbers. "What are my options?" I asked, my heart pounding as the reality of taking legal action against my own son began to sink in. Rebecca leaned back in her chair and explained my choices with professional clarity. "We could start with a formal demand letter, giving Kevin 30 days to respond with payment or a reasonable payment plan. If he refused or ignored it, we could file a civil lawsuit to recover the debt. With documentation this clear, she was confident about our chances of success. I signed the retainer agreement with hands that shook only slightly. Rebecca would handle all communication from this point forward. No more phone calls from Kevin that left me feeling confused and guilty. No more manipulation disguised as family concern. All business would go through the law office now. The walk back to my car felt different somehow. The afternoon sun seemed brighter, the air cleaner. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't carrying the weight of confusion and self-doubt. I had a plan, a professional advocate, and most importantly, I had finally stopped making excuses for Kevin's behavior. But the legal action was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I made other changes that felt enormous to me. Small steps toward reclaiming my independence and self-respect. I called the bank and set up automatic bill pay for all my expenses, ensuring I'd never again be in a position where I felt I had to ask Kevin for help if money got tight. I changed my emergency contact information everywhere it appeared: doctors, bank, insurance policies, all the places where Kevin's name had been listed for years. I replaced him with my neighbor, Dorothy, a retired nurse who was practical, reliable, and most importantly, wouldn't see an emergency as an opportunity to lecture me about being a burden. I cleaned out my freezer and threw away all the frozen casseroles I'd been saving for Kevin's visits. He hadn't eaten my cooking in over 2 years, always claiming he and Cleo were on some new diet or had already eaten. The freezer space felt liberating, available now for foods I actually wanted to eat. A week after meeting with Rebecca, the demand letter was ready. She read it to me over the phone, her voice crisp and professional. Dear Mr. Sanderson, this letter serves as formal demand for payment of outstanding loans made by your mother, Nora Sanderson, between 2009 and 2024. Based on documentation in our possession, you currently owe Mrs. Sanderson $85,247 in principal plus applicable interest. You have 30 days from receipt of this letter to contact our office to arrange payment or establish a reasonable payment plan. Failure to respond will result in civil action to recover the debt, including court costs and attorney fees. It sounded so official, so final. This wasn't a family discussion anymore about misunderstandings or hurt feelings. This was a business transaction where money was owed and payment was expected. The letter went out certified mail the next day. I would know exactly when Kevin received it, exactly when the 30-day clock started ticking toward either resolution or litigation. For the first time in months, I made plans that didn't revolve around Kevin's schedule or needs or potential disapproval. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was working overtime to fund Kevin's dreams. I made a doctor's appointment for the physical exam I'd been putting off, no longer worried about asking Kevin to drive me since I'd already arranged transportation with Dorothy. I bought groceries for one person instead of keeping extra food on hand in case Kevin visited unexpectedly. The smaller portions felt appropriate, honest, reflecting the reality of my life rather than the fantasy I'd been maintaining. I started taking evening walks around my neighborhood, something I'd stopped doing because I didn't want to miss Kevin's rare phone calls. The exercise felt good, and I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked for years while I was focused on being available for him. New houses, changing seasons, neighbors I'd never spoken to, but who waved when they saw me walking by. 3 days before Kevin would receive the demand letter, my phone rang. It was Dorothy from next door. Nora, honey, there's a young woman at your door, says she's your daughter-in-law. I told her you were at the store, but she's been sitting in that fancy car for over an hour. Cleo. My stomach clenched, but not with the old familiar anxiety. This time it was anticipation. She was here early, which meant they sensed something was coming. Thanks for letting me know, Dorothy. I'll be home in a few minutes. I wasn't at the store. I was at the coffee shop 2 blocks away, reading a mystery novel I'd bought on impulse, something I never would have done when I was constantly waiting for Kevin's calls. But I finished my coffee slowly, turned another page, and let Cleo wait. When I finally pulled into my driveway, she was leaning against her white Mercedes, scrolling through her phone with the practiced boredom of someone accustomed to having the world accommodate her schedule. She looked up as I got out of my car, and I saw something I'd never seen in her face before: uncertainty. Nora, she said, her voice unnaturally bright. I was hoping we could talk. I took my time gathering my purse and the book I'd been reading, letting her watch me move at my own pace instead of rushing to make her comfortable. About what? I asked. About the wedding? About what happened? She tucked a strand of perfectly highlighted hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture that surprised me. I think there might have been some misunderstandings. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, leaving it open behind me. She followed, her heels clicking on my hardwood floors. In my modest living room, surrounded by my comfortable, unfashionable furniture, she looked as out of place as I'd felt at her wedding reception. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, playing the hostess role that had been drilled into me since childhood, even though every instinct told me this woman deserved nothing from me. "Water would be nice." She perched on the edge of my couch like she was afraid it might contaminate her designer clothes. I took my time in the kitchen, filling a glass with ice water and arranging some crackers on a plate I didn't expect her to touch. When I returned, she was looking around the room with barely concealed disdain, her gaze lingering on the family photos I hadn't yet packed away. "So many pictures of Kevin," she said, accepting the water. "You must miss having him around more." It was a fishing expedition, I realized. She was here for information, trying to figure out why I hadn't called them, why I wasn't playing my usual role of the apologetic mother desperate for reconciliation. "Actually, I've been quite busy lately," I said, settling into my armchair with deliberate calm. "I've started taking some classes, reading more. It's amazing how much time you have when you're not constantly worried about other people's problems." Cleo's smile faltered slightly, clearly not the response she'd expected from the usually accommodating woman she was used to managing. "That's wonderful. Self-care is so important." She paused, working up to something. "Kevin mentioned you might be feeling a little isolated lately since the wedding. We were thinking maybe we could plan a family dinner soon, clear the air, the three of us together." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "Between us, I think Kevin feels terrible about what happened. He's just too proud to be the first one to reach out." Even now, faced with my complete silence for weeks, they were still trying to manage me with the same old manipulation. Make me feel guilty for not reaching out first. Make me believe Kevin was somehow the injured party. "That's interesting," I said. "What exactly does he feel terrible about?" Cleo blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "Well, the whole situation. It was such a stressful day. Emotions were running high. So he feels bad about laughing when you slapped me?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Cleo's composure cracked slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. "Nora, you have to understand that dress was incredibly expensive. And in the moment, you assaulted a 68-year-old woman over an accident and my son found it amusing," I interrupted, keeping my voice level and factual. "I'm curious which part of that he feels terrible about." Cleo set down her water glass with shaking hands, clearly realizing that her usual tactics weren't working. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in my driveway. Through the window, I could see Kevin getting out of his sedan, his face grim. He'd come to collect his wife and handle his mother, just like always. "You called him," I said. It wasn't a question. Cleo had the grace to look embarrassed. "I thought it might be better if we were all together for this conversation." The front door opened without a knock. Kevin walked in like he still lived here, his stride confident and proprietary, expecting to find his wife in tears and his mother apologizing. He stopped short when he saw us sitting calmly in the living room, clearly having expected a very different scene. "Mom," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Cleo said you two were having a talk." "We were discussing her apology," I said pleasantly, though I'm still waiting to hear it. Kevin's jaw tightened, his hands moving to rest on Cleo's shoulders in a gesture clearly meant to show solidarity against me. "I think we're all a little emotional here. Maybe we should take a step back." "I'm not emotional at all," I said. "I'm quite calm, actually. Calmer than I've been in years." I stood up, and both of them seemed to shrink back slightly. "You know what, Kevin? You're absolutely right. Accidents do happen. Like me accidentally discovering some very interesting documents while I was cleaning this week." Something flickered in his eyes, fear replacing the confident control he'd walked in with. "What kind of documents?" His voice was careful now, calculating. "Oh, just some old paperwork. Loan agreements, promissory notes, things I'd forgotten I'd kept." I smiled pleasantly. Amazing how different things look when you review them with fresh eyes. Kevin's face went pale, and Cleo looked between us with growing alarm. "Mom, if this is about money—" "Money?" I interrupted, my voice still sweet. "Why would this be about money? You've made it very clear over the years that family doesn't keep score. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Kevin tried to figure out how much I knew and what I planned to do with the information. Maybe we should continue this conversation another time, he said finally, when everyone's had a chance to cool down. Actually, I think my temperature is just right, I said, but you're welcome to leave anytime. It was the first time in 20 years I'd dismissed my son from my house, the first time I'd made it clear that my space was mine to control. They left without another word, Cleo's heels clicking rapidly across my porch. I watched through the window as they stood by their cars having an intense conversation, Kevin gesturing toward my house with obvious frustration. My phone rang 10 minutes after they drove away. Kevin's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. The demand letter reached Kevin on a Tuesday. Rebecca called at exactly 10:47 to confirm delivery. By 11:15, my phone was ringing nonstop. I didn't answer. The voicemails started angry and escalated to desperate. By Wednesday, he was at my door, pounding and calling my name while I calmly ate lunch in my kitchen. Friday was the deadline Rebecca had given them to respond. At 4:30 in the afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Sanderson, this is James Crawford from Crawford and Associates. I'm representing your son in this matter. A lawyer. They'd hired a lawyer rather than simply calling to discuss repayment like a family. You'll need to speak with my attorney, I said. Rebecca Patterson at Patterson and Associates. Mrs. Sanderson, perhaps we could resolve this without involving the courts. Family disputes are so much better handled privately. Mr. Crawford, your client stopped being my family the moment he decided I was worth laughing at while his wife assaulted me. Now he's just someone who owes me money. I hung up and called Rebecca immediately. They lawyered up, I told her. That tells us everything we need to know about their intentions. The civil suit was filed the following Monday. Within hours, I had 3 more voicemails from Kevin, each more panicked than the last. The threats came next, thinly veiled warnings about how this lawsuit would affect his career, his reputation, his marriage. Then came the guilt trips, relatives calling to beg on his behalf about family loyalty and forgiveness. I didn't respond to any of it. Every communication went through Rebecca, who handled Kevin's dramatics with professional detachment. The case took 8 months to resolve, 8 months of Kevin trying every manipulation tactic in his considerable arsenal. The settlement conference was held on a gray February morning in a sterile conference room downtown. Kevin sat across from me in an expensive suit, flanked by his attorney. He looked older somehow, stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at his wedding. My client is prepared to offer $40,000 to settle this matter, his lawyer began. Counter offer, Rebecca said without hesitation. Full amount owed plus interest and attorney fees, $102,400. Kevin's face went white. That's impossible. I don't have that kind of cash. You had it when you took it from your mother, Rebecca replied coolly. Figure it out. The negotiation lasted 6 hours. In the end, Kevin agreed to $60,000 immediately, the remainder in monthly installments of $1,800 for 2 years. As we signed the papers, Kevin looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Not love, not affection, but the grudging respect one gives to an opponent who's proven themselves formidable. Was it worth it? He asked quietly while the lawyers finalized documents. Destroying our relationship over money? I met his gaze steadily, feeling none of the old, familiar guilt or doubt. I didn't destroy anything, Kevin. I just stopped pretending it existed. The first payment arrived exactly on schedule, as did the second and third. Kevin never missed one, which told me he'd always had access to the money. He'd simply chosen not to repay me because he'd never faced consequences for his theft. I used the initial $60,000 to do something I'd dreamed about for decades. I booked a month-long trip to Scotland, staying in charming bed and breakfasts, exploring ancient castles, and talking to strangers who knew nothing about my failures as a mother, and saw only an interesting woman worth sharing stories with. In a pub in Edinburgh, I met Eleanor, a retired librarian from Glasgow who was traveling alone for the first time since her husband's death. We spent 4 days exploring the Highlands together, and when she mentioned thinking of visiting America, I invited her to stay with me. You have family in California? She asked over dinner. I have a son, I said without the old shame or defensiveness, but we're not close. It was the first time I'd said it aloud without feeling like I needed to explain or apologize. My son and I weren't close, and that was his choice, not my failure. Eleanor visited 6 months later, and we spent 2 wonderful weeks touring wine country, hiking in national parks, and discovering that friendship at our age could be even richer than it had been in youth. We made plans to travel together again, to places I'd never imagined I'd have the courage or resources to see. The monthly payments from Kevin continued like clockwork. We never spoke, but every check that arrived felt like a small victory. Not because of the money, but because it represented something I'd thought impossible, holding my son accountable for his actions. He'd learned that his mother wasn't an unlimited resource to be exploited, but a person deserving of basic respect and honesty. A year after the settlement, Dorothy mentioned she'd seen Kevin drive by the house several times but never stop. Maybe he wants to reconcile, she suggested gently. Maybe, I agreed. But reconciliation requires acknowledging wrongdoing, not just missing what you've lost. I wasn't bitter anymore. The anger that had sustained me through the legal proceedings had faded into something calmer but more permanent: acceptance. I accepted that I'd raised a son who was capable of treating his mother as badly as any stranger would. I accepted that my love for him hadn't been enough to make him a good person. Most importantly, I accepted that some relationships can't be saved, only survived. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. I'd redecorated with colors I loved instead of the neutral tones I'd thought were more acceptable. I'd replaced Kevin's photos with pictures from my travels, images that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. On my 70th birthday, I treated myself to a day at the spa. As I sat in the massage chair looking out at the garden, I realized something remarkable. I was happy. Not the desperate, conditional happiness that had depended on Kevin's approval, but a quiet, steady contentment that belonged entirely to me. That evening, Eleanor called from Glasgow to wish me happy birthday. We talked for an hour about our plans for her next visit, about the cooking class we wanted to take together, about the small apartment she was considering renting in my neighborhood for extended stays. After we hung up, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere across town, Kevin was living his life without me in it. For the first time, that felt like his loss, not mine. The last payment arrived on schedule 2 weeks later, along with a note in Kevin's handwriting. Debt paid in full. I deposited the check and threw the note away. Some debts, I'd learned, could never really be paid in full, but some freedoms were worth any price, and I had finally bought mine. Now I'm curious about you. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever gone through something like this? Let me know in the comments. And while you're here, I've left 2 of my other stories on screen. I promise they'll surprise you. Thanks for watching all the way to the end.